So, Boris Johnson is leading Britain towards a no-deal Brexit and possibly an election as he promises new money for the NHS and all manner of other things. But he's also promoting the idea of free ports. Today on the Debunking Economics podcast with Professor Steve Keen, we look at the idea of free ports and whether they could be a big winner for Britain post-Brexit, or are they just a way of keeping some car plants open in the turmoil that ensues? I'm Phil Dobbie. That's today on the Debunking Economics podcast. Yes, Boris Johnson wants to introduce free ports in the UK, 10 of them after Brexit, which the International Trade Secretary Liz Truss has said will create thousands of jobs. No tax revenue, of course, but lots of jobs. Well, I guess those people who've got those jobs will be paying income tax. And the idea of free ports is very simple. You can import goods, do something to them, or perhaps not, and re-export them without paying any taxes or any of that cumbersome paperwork that we associate with importing and exporting. Now, there's nothing new about them. Britain had them before, and there are several thousand of them worldwide, supposedly employing around 66 million workers. So, Steve, I mean, this is an area, really, isn't it, that looking at this sort of thing that first got you involved and interested in the world of economics, isn't it?
Yeah, not so much actually interested because I've already done my undergraduate arts degree majoring in economics, so I must clarify that. But the first position I got out of specifically getting into national economic policy was working for the Australian Freedom from Hunger campaign. And at the time, before I started doing that, I was looking at the whole idea of multinationals relocating production from the first world to the third world. And of course, a major reason why they were doing that was to take advantage of lower wages. And then I'm not quite certain which country did it first, but you're talking back in the late 1970s, at the very latest, because I was writing about this during the 1970s. So countries would open up free trade. They called free trade zones, or they called them export processing zones, EPZs. And a lot of them were based in countries like Malaysia initially, Indonesia, and so on, because these countries already had, of course, a strong ex-colonial link. And one of the first things they wanted to do after the political contretemps of pushing out the colonial overlords, which, of course, they weren't supposed to have to do. The colonials were supposed to leave voluntarily. That's the agreement they made with all the liberation movements in Latin, in Southeast Asia, when those movements supported the Allied troops against the Japanese. But let's not discuss that little political failing. But in the aftermath, those countries had the best links, as you mentioned, like Malaysia, having been an ex-UK colony. Had a reasonably good political link with the UK. The Philippines, of course, being, for all intents and purposes, for quite some time, an American colony, they could do it easily. I mean, so all these countries which were not the major actors today got in there first. And what they were basically offering was no import tariffs on anything you bring into the country, no export tariffs either, huge tax concessions from the developing country, and of course low wages, and we're talking about phenomenal margins. I mean, not comparing UK wages to American wages, but comparing Indonesian or Malaysian wages at the time, which were at least a factor of 10 cheaper.
So all of this favours, of course, international corporations then. It doesn't help develop new national firms in those economies. It just helps international corporations come in and get advantage of those low wages.
That was the initial thing. I mean, you can ultimately then see a lot of local companies opening up as service wings or component manufacturers for the multinationals themselves. And of course, that's what went wrong with that strategy for virtually every country that did it was that the firms were 100% foreign owned, and the control as well as the profits were going offshore, being taxed. Now the Chinese, and I had my first exposure to the Chinese when I ditched the Freedom from Hunger campaign because they wouldn't support my idea about running conferences between journalists from different countries. So I resigned from the Freedom from Hunger campaign and started doing it myself. Bumped into somebody at a conference where I spoke on the idea of issues oriented journalism. She happened to be the director of the Australia-China Council. And I then took a group of, I think it was 9 Australian journalists for a conference with about 20 or 30 Chinese journalists in Beijing in 1981-82 during the trial of the Gang of Four. This is one of the fun little things I've done as a side activity. And we then did a tour of China under of course, in transition to Deng Xiaoping's rule, while they were literally doing the trial of the Gang of Four was being broadcast through loudspeakers all over the city as we were having our seminar. So that's the period of time. And we're shown all these various attempts by the Chinese to industrialize. And we'd like to be taken to a province we go to say Sichuan province, and we're taken to see I think it was a furniture manufacturing firm. And they had this massive boost to their production in this particular commune. They were still organized in communes at the time. And they were exporting most of their products to Shanghai for, they're making, couches and stuff like that, exporting to Shanghai, and they were then sold around the country. And we had to always try to find out what the hell was going on. But I finally got the answer that how did they make the sales, quote unquote, and I'm quoting here the translation. We sent out propagandists. We'd call them Abbott. Okay. Well, the propagandists made a link with a state factory in Shanghai, and they were taking part of the output of this commune and rebadging it as coming from the state factory. Well, that works for one factory, which is a show commune. You try scaling it up to the entire bloody country, it was bound to collapse because they couldn't all take over 40% or more of the in manufacturing businesses state enterprises without bankrupting the state enterprises. So that was nonsense.
Right. How's this getting us to free trade zones, though? So those
don't go away. Yeah. We got that.
Just want to remind you the point of this podcast, but that's fine. Happy for us to take a side journey, so long as we get back there sometime.
Okay. We got down to Shenzhen, which is where the very first free trade zone was built by China, and that that was the first time I confronted what I thought was really seriously intelligent Chinese management. And the boss gave you a quick introduction and then gave way to one of the planners. No ego involved in that, which itself was impressive. And the planner said, well, what we're going to do is we're offering free trade zones, of course, the usual advantages of low wages, no regulation, no import tariffs, no export tariffs on goods coming in and out of the trade zone. But we also require any foreign multinational setting up business here to have a Chinese partner. Mm-hmm. And this is the part that took my breath away. And within 5 years, the Chinese partner has to own 50% of the business.
Yeah.
Now, that was from zero,
Yeah. And that became the modus operandi, obviously, for foreign investment in China.
What it meant was huge. They basically were building a capitalist class using the export processing zones. Yeah. Of course, that capitalist class was mainly ex-Communist Party apparatchiks and some local entrepreneurs as well, of course. That's where things like Foxconn and so on came on. So what happened was Chinese wages rose across the country, more on the coastal regions than inland, obviously, rather than the businesses then relocating because they're owned by foreign multinationals, they're owned by local companies. To some extent, they weren't allowed to leave, or if the leaving was made, it was a decision involving the Chinese side as well. Yeah. And it said, this is going to work. This is going to work, and it worked like gangbusters. So that's the basic thing that made those work so effectively. And I noticed in that document from our Tory friend that 20% of China's exports, 20% of China's GDP are made in these free trade zones. So that's huge. But what you look at was being proposed for the UK. Last time I checked, even though they weren't particularly good, UK wages weren't 1/10 that of the...
No. And isn't that the point? That, this is an idea which lends itself more for the developing economies of the world rather than the developed economies of the world. Well, look, this is just the first part of this discussion. If you want to hear it in full, Boris's idea for free ports, are they right for Britain right now? You'll have to subscribe to the podcast. And you can do that by going to debunkingeconomics.com and choosing one of the subscription options there, or become a supporter of Steve Keen on Patreon. Go to patreon.com/Prof Steve Keen and pledge $10 or more support to his work each month, and you'll get access to this and all the other podcasts in this series. I'm Phil Dobbie. He's Steve Keen. See you back here again soon.